Thanks for stopping by today. This video is about Edward Pellom, who was a Black Revolutionary War soldier from Connecticut. This project centers on a man by the name of Calvin Goddard, who was a lawyer and judge and several other things in the town of Norwich, Connecticut, just after the Revolutionary War period. And he was one of the lawyers that defended Prudence Crandall in her trial. And during that trial, he made a speech in which he stated that he had helped 19 Black men receive their pensions from their service in the Revolutionary War. And I've made it my mission to track down those 19 men, research them, and put the results up here on a video. So this is the Edward Pellom installment. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see his pension application, the cover page to it. And this one piece of paper tells us several things. His pension certificate was numbered 519. He lived in Connecticut at the time he applied for his pension. His name, Edward Pellom. It mentions a Captain Ripley. Edward was a private, which is a good indication that he was a colored person because colored people could not become officers in the Revolutionary War. He fought for the Connecticut line. 1776, he served for 1 year. He received his pension in 1818. And down at the bottom, you can see that his pension certificate was sent to Calvin Goddard, Esquire, Judge of New London County in Norwich, Connecticut. Edward served actually in the war for like 4.5 years. And this is his first enlistment. He enlisted under the Colonel Jedediah Huntington's 8th Regiment of Connecticut Militia, which was formed on July 6, 1775. And you can see here at the top of this listing is the officers. The captain of this company was John Ripley, and we did see Captain Ripley mentioned on his pension application. The company was formed, he was commissioned on July 6th. And if you look down the list of names here, you can see when these men enlisted, and you see several of them enlisted on July 8th. So very soon after the formation of this company, many of these men enlisted. And you can see down near the bottom there, where you generally find the names of Black or indigenous people who served, is the name of Edward Pellom, along with Luther Japhet, who was an enslaved man, and a Negro man named Nero. This is Edward Pellom's actual discharge from this unit, signed by Jedediah Huntington, Colonel. Edward Pellom is discharged from the Army with honor, on air. I like that spelling. I think I'm going to start using it. He had to actually send his discharge papers in with his pension application, so they are now held by the National Archives in the pension. So you can actually see their actual discharge. Now, I said that John Ripley here at the top is from Windham, Connecticut. His first lieutenant is from Coventry, Connecticut. So these militia units were formed locally. John Ripley said, hey, make me a captain and I can find enough men to form a company and join your regiment. And that's how it happened. So these first men that signed up undoubtedly knew John Ripley. They were men who were known to him. He was known to them. And this is the area from which he would have drawn his volunteers. Ripley was from Windham. This is a 1770 map, and those of you who are familiar with this area of Connecticut will notice that there's a lot of towns missing because they were formed after 1770. But this is the basic area that these men would have been drawn from. And that list is about 75 names, and I just did a really quick search through them, and 16 of them I found where they were from quickly. 8 were from Windham, 4 from Lebanon, a couple from Coventry, 1 from Mansfield, and one from Colchester. So they're all from this area. And as I said, these early enlistments particularly undoubtedly knew John Ripley. So he's pulling men from this basic area. 14 of those men enlisted on July 8th after the unit was formed on July 6th. So these are the men that are probably very close to John Ripley's residence and knew him. Edward Pellom, this is a page from his pension application. And rather than have you try to read that scrawl of handwriting there, this was probably written by either Calvin Goddard himself or one of his clerks in his office. But after his 1775 service, he enlisted again for 1 year in a regiment also commanded by Jedediah Huntington. And he stayed with them until after the Battle of Trenton. And then he enlisted again in a regiment commanded by Colonel John Durkee from the spring of 1778 until November 1778, when he was selected as one of the guard for Clement Biddle, the forage master general. In other words, in charge of rustling up food for all these soldiers. Biddle employed him as a wagoner from November 1778 until April 1779. He was discharged, but stayed with the regiment, still with Jedediah Huntington, the 5th Connecticut. In 1780, Colonel Heman Swift was his commander, and on the 9th day of December, 1780, he was finally discharged. Now, one thing I really want to point out that's very important in this pension application is that Edward Pellom signed his name to it. Of these 19 men that I am researching, he is the only one who could sign his name. Everybody else simply made an X for a mark on the paperwork. Edward could write his name. It indicates some level of education, and that might help us identify him later. I showed you one of his discharge papers. Here's two more. His discharge from Clement Biddle, and I hope you can read that at the top. Edward Pellom, mulatto. Mulatto is a term that we don't like to use these days, but was a very common term back in colonial Connecticut and during the Revolutionary War. And it would refer to a colored person who was actually a mixture, very often of Black and Indian or indigenous people, sometimes a mixture of Black and white, but more often Black and Indian. So Edward Pellom was not referred to as a Black man, but as a mulatto. He faithfully served as a wagoner, blah, 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 blah. He was discharged and permitted to return to his home at Coventry in Connecticut. So we know that at the time that he signed up for the war, he lived in Coventry, which again is right there next to Lebanon and Windham. And down at the bottom here is his last discharge. Heman Swift discharged him on December 9th, 1780. This is a payroll from his last service. Down at the bottom there, the last name you can see, Edward Pellom. Town to which they belong, Coventry. Again, he is from Coventry. He's a private, and you can see over on the far right-hand side that he was discharged on December 9th, 1780, which we saw earlier. Again, just going to look at this map. Coventry, very close to Windham. Lebanon's in between them. This is the target area for where we're going to try to research Edward Pellom to see what else we can find out about him. And one of the first things we do when we're looking for people in this era is check out the census records. And I did find Edward in 1790. At least I'm pretty certain that this is him. He wasn't easy to find. I ended up having to go through the census basically page by page and line by line looking for households of free people of color to see if I could identify him. And this was actually indexed on Ancestry.com as Negro Roward, R-O-W-A-R-D. But there's some interference there with that G from above and the odd loopy tail there on the D. But that actually does say Edward. Edward is not a very common name for Black people in that era, which is why I think that this is probably our Edward, just because, you'd see the name Cato or Prince or Primus and things like that, very common. Edward, not so common. So if this is him, he was in the section of people who lived in Colchester. Again, that's right in our area. And he headed a household of 6 free people of color. Later on, he lived in Griswold. This is a listing of church records from Griswold. And we can see here at the very bottom, Edward Black died July 26, 1819, at age 67. The age is only going to be approximate during that time period. A lot of people didn't even really know how old they were. So that's an approximate age. You can see the line above that. His wife had died just a couple of months earlier. And during the period from 1808 through 1812, he had 3 young children die. And if you look at the age of his wife during those years, she would have been of childbearing years. So these are probably children of this woman. So looking at this, I say, oh, Edward lived in Griswold in 1808, and he lived in Griswold in 1812. That means I should be able to find him in the 1810 census in Griswold. I just have to look hard enough. Well, there's a problem with that theory. And that problem is named Lodowick Fosdick. I don't believe Lodowick Fosdick had any descendants. I don't think he had any children. And I kind of looked that up because I don't like to disparage people's ancestors. But if there's one person that I could go back in time and strangle, it would be Lodowick Fosdick. He was the enumerator for the US Census in 1810 for the towns of New London, Groton, Waterford, Montville, Lyme, Preston, and Colchester. Of course, Griswold in 1810 was part of Preston. Griswold did not become a separate town until 1815. So the fact that Lodowick Fosdick enumerated the town of Preston is important to my research because this is what he did. Here's the first page enumerating the town of Preston. And on first glance at this page, it looks like the first dozen families that he enumerated all had free people of color living in their households. They did not. The top line there, Sally Morgan, who had 3 elderly women in her household, did not also have 6 free people of color living with her. Lodowick could not be bothered to write down the names of the heads of households of free people of color in the towns he enumerated. He just stuck them at the top of the page. So in other words, these are in order of people that he interviewed, the households that he visited, Sally Morgan, Lynn Morgan, Huldah Downs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if he would come to a household that were free people of color, he just stuck them at the top. So we cannot pull out the names of the heads of households in these towns of free people of color in 1810 because Lodowick couldn't be bothered. So this is the first page for the second society in Preston, which became Griswold. Lodowick did the same thing. Those first 8 or so households probably did not contain free people of color. This is really obvious when you look at Mary Keeney, an elderly white woman, did not have 3 people living with her. So we cannot trace Edward Pellom at this time in Griswold because the census enumerator just couldn't be bothered. I possibly found him in 1800. Now, remember, a lot of times that they simply would not register the last name of a Black man. They would just say, this is Edward and he's a Negro. This could be him in Voluntown in 1800. If you look down towards the bottom there, it looks like it says EDDS, a Negro, with a head of household of free people of color of 10 people. I'm not real certain on this, but it could be, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But I did find other evidence of Edward in these locations in this time period. Thanks to Family Search instituting this AI search where you can search records by last name and it will come up with all sorts of wonderful results that I would have never found otherwise. For example, at the top here, the estate of Frederick Fanning. Frederick Fanning died sometime before 1813, and when his estate was probated, the executor submitted a list of expenses. And here we see Edward Pellom was paid not much money, a little bit of money for work in the garden. Never would have found this without this AI search. 1802 down the bottom here, Phineas Pierce of Plainfield, his estate, same thing, list of expenses. Alvin Wilson and Edward Pellom were paid a small amount of money for some sort of a labor. It doesn't indicate what. It could be digging the grave. It could be just about anything. Estate of Ebenezer Gallup of Plainfield in 1799. Again, we see Edward Pellom was paid 59 cents for something. But these are the kind of things that can place a person into a location with this new research. It's just wonderful. Now, this talks about Plainfield, which we haven't talked about before. So where is Plainfield? Just north of where Griswold is today. Here's Preston. Here's where Griswold was established later. Over here, just to the east, is Voluntown, which is where we found that possible census enumeration in 1800. Just north of that, Plainfield, where those two men lived, whose estates were being probated. Quite possible that Edward lived somewhere here around the border of those three towns. So going back to this record, we can make some assumptions about Edward. He was born about 1752, give or take a few years. Probably somewhere in the Coventry, Windham, Lebanon area, because he lived in Coventry at the time that he enlisted. He was said to have been a mulatto. And again, we talked about the definition of mulatto, and he could write. So he was at least some level of education. The fact that he had some level of education makes me think it's possible that he was born a free man. So as I said earlier, a lot of times in these records of Black residents in early Connecticut, people just didn't bother to write down any last name for them. So I decided to search for just someone named Edward, born about 1750-ish in this area of Connecticut. Edward is not a super common name for a Black man in that era. And I actually found one that's a possibility. This states, the children of Peter, Negro man, servant to Mr. David Richardson, by his wife Mary, were born in order of time as follows: Freelove, Stephen, Edward, and Peter. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about this record. First of all, notice right away that this is all the same handwriting. Okay, this was not written at the time that these events occurred. He did not write that Freelove was born in 1745 and then 6 years later write in the exact same handwriting that Peter was born in 1751. This is a copy, and it says right on page 1 of this volume that this is a copy of Volume 1, Lebanon Records of Births, Marriages, and Deaths by C.J. Abel, Registrar. So I looked up C.J. Abel. His name is Charles Judson Abel, and he was the town clerk in Lebanon for 38 years. So this copy must have been done sometime during that tenure, so sometime between 1873 and 1911. So this record was created some 120 years after these children were actually born. Now, the reason I point that out is anytime you copy a record, you introduce the possibility of errors or misreading it. So it's wonderful to have a record like this, but you have to kind of keep that in the back of your head that there could be errors in this record. For example, both Freelove and Stephen were born on the 8th of March, 2 years apart. Is that possible? Well, it certainly is possible, but a little odd to see. We cannot assume that this copy is error-free. So, can I find anything else about this Peter, who is a servant to David Richardson and his wife Mary? It doesn't state any person that Mary is a servant to. It doesn't look like she's a servant to David Richardson also. So, is Mary a free woman? Stonington church records have a clue here. This is a marriage recorded in 1742, March 17th. Peter, Negro servant to Stephen Richardson, and Mary Jones, an Indian Negro mulatto. There's that word again. She is half Indian, half Negro. Probably an Indian woman and a Negro man, but can't really tell that. Again, Peter is servant to Stephen Richardson. It does not state that Mary is a servant to anyone. She is probably a free woman. Some further research in the Stonington area might reveal that, but I have not done that. Now, this says that he's a servant to Stephen Richardson, whereas the other record said David Richardson. So what's that all about? Well, their marriage record is in Stonington. But 3 years later, in the Lebanon church records, we see that Stephen Richardson from Stonington was allowed to become a member of the Lebanon church, along with Peter, a Negro man from Stonington. So these are the same two people. They've moved from Stonington to Lebanon sometime around 1745. Stephen Richardson died about 4 years later, and he had a will that is online. And his will says, after my decease, I do will and set my Negro man called Peter to be a free man from all my heirs, executors, and administrators forever. Stephen has emancipated Peter in his will. And that actually did happen. Peter was a free man. But he ended up in a little bit of trouble within just a couple of years. This is a court record from 1755. An enslaved man by the name of Caesar from Norwich was arrested for counterfeiting. And along with Caesar, they arrested Peter. They arrested Peter for passing these counterfeit bills, knowing that they were counterfeit, sometimes called uttering a counterfeit bill. Peter went to trial and was convicted. Now, oddly enough, I actually know somebody who back in around 1980 was discovered to be passing counterfeit money. And he was convicted of this, and his penalty was a fine and some community service. Peter's penalty was slavery for life. If you read down here, the said Richardson, who is David Richardson, has sprung him from jail, and in return, Peter must serve him to the day of death of said Peter, and to be kept within the bounds of Lebanon. Peter sentenced to slavery for life for passing counterfeit bills. So we see the name Pellom associated with Edward. I actually found a couple of instances where the name Pellom is associated with someone named Peter in this general area. And again, Pellom, kind of an unusual name. No matter what the spelling is, it can be spelled P-E-L-L-O-M, U-M, P-E-L-H-A-M. Spelling was not really standardized in those days. You have to keep that in mind all the time. So Peter Pellom appears as a debtor in the estate of Elijah Ripley. Where have we seen the name Ripley before? John Ripley, captain of the militia unit in which Edward Pellom served. This is in Coventry. Coventry church records in May 1777 notes the death of a Peter Pellom. Now, these records, we can't really be certain that they are, which Peter they are, because remember, the father was named Peter, he had a son named Peter. These records could relate to either one of them. I suspect it's probably the younger Peter, but I'm not certain, and I don't know if there's any way to figure that out. So I continued searching this last name of Pellom using Fold 3 newspaper census records. It wasn't an unusual name. You find a few of them scattered here and there. There's a white family in South Carolina with the last name of Pellom, P-E-L-L-O-M, and it's obviously not this family. But I found this on Fold 3, another Revolutionary War soldier with the last name of Pellom, and his name was Stephen Pellom. He lived in Thetford, Vermont. And I also found a little cluster of people named Pellom in the Thetford, Vermont area, or nearby West Fairleigh, Vermont. This shows that Stephen Pellom served for 4 days. Now, this is a militia unit that was put together pretty quickly in response to an alarm at Stratford. They thought that there was going to be an attack there. They put a militia unit together really quick, and they went to Stratford to protect the town. Turned out it was a false alarm, and they all went back home. So Stephen only served for 4 days. This is in 1775, I believe. Stephen died in 1789, which is a pity because I can't find him in the 1790 census, can I, if he's dead? He apparently had quite a few debts. Says here that he's late of Thetford, Vermont. He was insolvent. In other words, he doesn't have enough property, enough assets to cover his debts. So they've asked for all the debtors to come in and present their claims. And when they probated his estate, there was a long list of debts. The inventory, he didn't have much to show. His entire estate was only worth 12 pounds. His dwelling house was only worth 6 pounds. That's not much. He probably didn't even own the property it stood on, just the house itself. But none of these records indicate his race. We don't know if this is a white man, black man, Indian man, or anywhere in between. But I do want to point out that Vermont never legally recognized slavery within their borders. In 1777, they passed a law abolishing slavery. It was illegal in Vermont, and they gave full voting rights to African American males. That didn't last, but they did it. Vermont was the first to. So if he is a person of color, it's not really going to state it in the records because they didn't recognize slavery. So I went looking for a history of Thetford, Vermont, and I found it online in the Gazetteer of Orange County, Vermont. In the town of Thetford, says that Samuel Gillette was one of the early settlers of Thetford, and he was born in Colchester, Connecticut. He married in Lebanon, Connecticut, right in our target area. Most of Vermont was settled by men from Connecticut, so I wasn't surprised to find he was from Connecticut, but he was right there from our target area, which was wonderful. So one of the earliest families in that town, he reportedly brought with him 2 enslaved persons. And since slavery was never officially recognized in Vermont, they probably lived as free people. So what can I find out in the 1790 census about free people of color in Thetford, Vermont? And it turns out there's only 3 families, heads of families listed. The first one at the top there is Nero Cross. Now, where did we see the name Nero before? Down here with Edward Pellom in the 10th Company, John Ripley, captain. Is this the same Nero? I don't know. I didn't go down that rabbit hole, but it certainly deserves some more research to find out. The other one was George Knox with 4 people in his household. I didn't do any research on him, but down here, this one caught my eye. Peter Thomas, maybe because of the name Peter, I just glommed onto it. But anyway, Peter Thomas with 4 people in his household. I did do a little bit of research about Peter. Peter was a property owner, bought property in Thetford in 1788. When he died, his estate was probated, and his widow was given her dower rights, her widow's thirds. The widow's name is Freelove Thomas. Where have we seen the name Freelove before? The oldest child of Peter and Mary from Lebanon. This is very interesting. We've got all these Lebanon connections going up to Thetford, Vermont. What else can we find out about Freelove to kind of show that this is indeed the same Freelove? Kind of an unusual name again. Well, Freelove sold her inherited property in 1810. She signed that with a mark, not her name. The witnesses for this deed were Irene Thayer and Martin Pellom. What a coincidence. Who is Martin Pellom? I find him in West Fairleigh, Vermont, the 1800 census, down at the bottom there, heading a household of 3 free people of color. Martin Pellom is a person of color. Freelove Thomas was married to a Black man, is almost certainly a person of color. Very small group of colored people in this area, Thetford, West Fairleigh, Vermont. To think that this is just coincidence, I can't go there. Found Martin Pellom in a couple more census records, 1810 in Thetford. It's hard to follow across there, but that 4 on the far right is his household. And again in 1820 in West Fairleigh, when they started breaking out the households a little bit more into how many males, how many females. Martin Pellom died in 1850, and he is buried there in Orange County, Vermont. He actually has a headstone. Age 77, which means he was born about 1773, about the same time that Stephen Pellom was a young man serving in the militia. I think this almost is certainly Stephen Pellom's son, Martin. Martin Pellom's estate went through probate, 1851. This names his legal heirs. Stephen Pellom, probably named after his grandfather, probably Martin's son, and Lumen Pellom. Now that really caught my eye because I had already run into Lumen Pellom when I was researching the Pelloms in Connecticut. I came across this record. Lumen T. Pellom of Hartford married Lucretia Caples of East Haddam. Where's East Haddam? Do I have to show you the map again? No, I don't. She's right from that area around Lebanon, Windham, Coventry, East Haddam, all in the same area. Probably a woman that was known to his cousins, met her through them. Here's the 1850 census for Lumen and Lucretia Pellom in Dutchess County, New York. Lumen is 33 years old, born in Vermont. Lucretia in Connecticut. And here they are in 1870 in Newburgh, New York. Lumen Pellom with his wife Lucretia. Lumen born in Vermont. He's got $2,000 worth of property. He's a barber. He has a son named Lumen, another son named Thornton. I believe he had a couple of other children also. Now, since they ended up in New York, I, of course, went to the Fulton Postcards site to see if I could find them in the newspapers anywhere, and I did. Over on the left-hand side there is the death of Lucretia on March 24th, 1879, wife of Lumen. In the center is the death of Lumen T. Pellom, died at the home of his son, Lumen J. Pellom, in April of 1893. And on the far right is the son, Lumen J. Pellom, a colored leader, died in 1918, leader among colored people, born in Newburgh, died in Newburgh. This Pellom family is, pretty interesting, worthy of a lot more research. What I try to do with my research is start from the bottom up. I start with these Revolutionary War soldiers and try to bring their families forward until about the Civil War era. Hopefully people who are researching their ancestry, going from the top down, can meet up here somewhere. So I don't continue with this research as a general rule, but this is what I found pretty quickly about the Pellom family. Again, I'm not sure which Peter is which in some of those records. This Peter may have died young and his death was not recorded, not unusual. But have I proven my case that this is a record of the birth of children to Peter Pellom and his wife, Mary Jones? We have a free love that's associated with the Pellom family in Vermont, of which Stephen Pellom is with her. Edward Pellom, Peter Pellom. You'll have to judge whether or not I've made my case. Now, we've talked a little bit about Stephen's children. Let's just talk about, did Edward have children? Now, we know that he had some that died very young. Edward's death there in 1819, that's the bottom of a page. Flip the page over and you'll see some records from Griswold for Farewell Pellom. Farewell married Susanna Simons, who was the daughter of another Revolutionary War soldier named Simeon Simons. They were both of Griswold. They married in 1818. We know that Edward Pellom was in Griswold in 1818. He died there in 1819. He applied for his pension from there in 1818. I think this is probably Edward's son. Don't have any documentation saying so. Farewell also had a child die very young in 1821. Again, he's still in Griswold. Farewell married Susanna in 1818. The marriage lasted about 16 years, and Susan Pellom took off, and Farewell Pellom published this notice in the newspaper. You run across these quite often when couples break up, and what he's basically saying is, don't trust her on my account. I'm not paying any of her debts. She's on her own. And this is in 1834. 1820 census in Griswold. Up at the top there, it's hard to read because of those numbers stamped over it, but that's Farewell Pellom on the very first line, heading a household of free people of color. Edward had his own Farewell, had his own run-in with the law in 1831. He was charged with assaulting a man by the name of John Law, beating him, kicking him, whipping him. Farewell spent 19 weeks in jail awaiting trial, and after all that, he was fined $10. But he also had to pay the costs of keeping him in jail all that time. Later in the same area in Norwich, we find a man named Thomas A. Pellom, and there's a couple of other Pelloms in Norwich, all of which are Black or colored people. This one here says Thomas Pellom married Mary Ann Robinson, both of Norwich, and they are colored persons. That's in 1839. And down below, Thomas Pellom died in Norwich, August 28th, 1855. He was age 40. Very well could be one of Pellom's sons. He was a Black male, born in Norwich, died in Norwich. He was a laborer. Again, this family deserves a lot more research than I'm able to give it at this time. I hope I've been able to connect enough dots so somebody else can pick up on this when they're researching their own Pellom family or associated families. So thank you for watching today. My email address is there if you have any interest in this family, if you have more information. If you have any questions about how I came to these conclusions, please drop me a line. Always happy to hear from people. Thank you.